they often are discussing the possibility of a blue wave in 2018. But what has a blue wave meant historically, or just a wave election in general meant historically? So that's what we set out to discuss and look at with this new report, is what would have to happen in order to see a wave election in 2018. So Rob Oldham, he is one of our co-authors of this report, and he is joining us today to talk about wave elections. So thanks for joining us, Rob.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Great to be here.
Yeah, okay, so first off, tell me what the parameters are that Ballotpedia set for defining a wave election. Let's just start basic here. What parameters did you look at and identify with this?
Yeah, sure. So we were working from the idea that if waves can be defined, and that's a big if, they should be significant and relatively rare historical events. So we looked at the last 100 years of election data, that's 1918 to 2016, and decided that 20% of elections, or 1 in 5, should be waves. Now that 20% figure is a little bit arbitrary, but it's not too different from how other professions define significant and rare events. For example, brokers define bear and bull markets by looking at whether stock prices fluctuate 20% from the annual average. So we looked at the last 100 years and found that in the top 20% of elections, where the president's party performed the poorest, his party lost at least 48 House seats, 7 Senate seats, 7 gubernatorial seats, and 494 state legislative seats. And those numbers, those thresholds, are what Democrats would have to gain in order for 2018 to be considered a wave under our definition.
So for me, that 48 and that, especially that 494 state legislative seats, I think this just gives, for me at least, a really concrete framework to look at what could be a wave. So I think as all this discussion has boiled up about the possibility of a wave election in 2018, you hear numbers thrown out like 20 seats or 25 for U.S. House. And that's not, when you look at there being 435 seats in the House, that's not really a lot. And so giving this 20%, even if it is just arbitrary and looking at history, I think that it gives a better framework to put into context, because we do know that, correct, presidents, their first term in office, that first midterm cycle, they do lose seats. That's just the trend, and that's what we see happening every 4 years or 8 years, depending on when we get the new president. So this 20% really does help us think about, all right, that's 48 seats. What exactly does that mean? Here's kind of this threshold that would really be considered. It would fit in with these other historical waves in the past. So that's really helpful framework for me. So walk me through these historical U.S. House waves. How many times have they occurred? Give me some examples of when they have occurred in the past 100 years and what that looked like.
Yeah, sure. So House waves, that's the one everyone's looking to in 2018. That's the big one. And so looking back since 1918, we found 11 House waves. So the biggest one was in 1932, where Republicans lost 97 seats. And this was the election where Democrat Franklin Roosevelt defeated the Republican president, Herbert Hoover. And as you probably know, this happened right after the economy crashed and the Great Depression began. So those are just a few of the themes that we'll see in wave elections. They often occur when the economy crashes or when the president is unpopular. So looking kind of forward in history, the most recent House wave was 2010, where the Democratic Party lost 63 seats during Barack Obama's first midterm election. Before that, we had a wave election in 1994, and again, Democrats lost 54 seats, and this was during Bill Clinton's first midterm. So that's another theme that you will see in wave elections. They are much more likely to occur during a midterm election when the president is not on the ballot. Often a president will become unpopular during their first 2 years in office, and you will see their supporters lose energy or even, in some cases, switch their partisan support. And that will allow a mobilized opposition to pick up more seats than they might normally do.
Yeah, that cannot be understated, this idea of the president's first midterm election cycle. So one way I also wanted to contextualize this with you, Rob, is what does the overall landscape of U.S. House races look like in 2018? And what I'm most referencing is how many races has Ballotpedia identified as potential battlegrounds in 2018? So, we have this figure in mind now, this 48 seats. How many seats are we looking at to be truly competitive that could flip from R to D in 2018? Is this a strong possibility? How likely is this year to become a wave election?
Absolutely. So we have 52 battleground seats in the U.S. House this year, according to Ballotpedia's metric, and 45 of them are in Republican-held seats. So it seems like what you said, what our question is whether Democrats will win basically all these seats and pick up maybe a few more that we weren't expecting, which would give them the 48 seats that they would need to have a wave under our definition. So I am not an election forecaster, but you can see some of the indicators such as Democratic performance in special elections and Trump's national popularity, which suggests that they probably will have a decent election year in 2018 at least. But just based off the number of battlegrounds, they would have to win almost every one of them to make it into the top 20% of elections over the last 100 years. And I imagine that would be pretty difficult, if not unprecedented. So election analysts like Dave Wasserman at the Cook Political Report say that Republicans have structural advantages, whether those come from redistricting or the geographic distribution of their voting coalition, that make it even more difficult for Democrats and to even win the 23 seats that they need to take control of the House. So clearly there's a bit of a disconnect between what Democrats need and what they would need to have a wave under our definition. So I think this is a good opportunity to look back at our methodology for how we defined a wave. We looked at the last 100 years of election data and used that to derive the 48 seat figure for the House. However, a lot of political science probably wouldn't have done that. They probably would have looked at elections after 1945 because the country's politics changed a good bit during the Great Depression and World War II. So it's sometimes hard to compare the elections that happened before 1945 and the ones that happened after. So generally after 1945, for a variety of reasons, waves became smaller. So if you actually applied our 20% definition to only the post-1945 elections, you'll see that the new wave threshold would shrink to 30 seats, which sounds a lot more doable for Democrats in 2018 than 48.
Yeah, definitely does. But it is interesting to see now from right after the Trump election or right after the inauguration in January 2017, where everybody was predicting massive wins for Democrats in 2018. It has been interesting to see that kind of be tampered a little bit as we've been moving through the cycle, and this idea that they would still need to win a full 23 seats to retake the House. That's still a steep thing, even in the first presidential midterm. So 30 does seem much more feasible than the 48, but we'll have to see. It's a big chunk of those battleground races that would have to turn in their favor. All right, so now let's move on to the U.S. Senate. So I do know that as you guys were compiling this report, that it was much harder to set the parameters for the U.S. Senate and what it would take to be a blue wave in 2018. Can you tell us a little bit more about those and the methodology that went into that figure?
Sure. So the main problem with Senate elections is that they change every cycle. So as you may know, only 1/3 of the chamber is up every 2 years. So it's quite possible that one of the key conditions to have a wave, which is that a party must have seats that it can actually win, is not present even if the party's base is energized. So 2018 is a perfect example of this because it has virtually no chance of becoming a wave as we define it, which would be a gain of 7 seats for Democrats. Democrats already control 26 of the 35 seats up in 2018, and there are really only 2 seats that they have a good chance of winning, which is Arizona and Nevada, and 2 where it's possible, which are Texas and Tennessee. Beyond that, though, they really don't have many opportunities. And moreover, they would also have to defend 10 seats in states that Trump won in 2016. Some of those states, like Missouri, Indiana, West Virginia, and North Dakota, weren't even close in 2016. So it's likely that Democrats will lose at least a couple of those. So you would never really have this problem in the House where there's a mismatch between partisan energy and the seats that are vulnerable, because every seat is up 2 years, and thus those seats are always going to be vulnerable to a wave election.
Great, thank you. Yeah, the numbers are. It's hard for Democrats to overcome just the number of seats that they're defending this year versus the number of seats defeats. The number of seats Republicans are defending this year, especially when you look at which states swung for Trump in 2016. And it's really interesting to look. Sometimes at Ballotpedia, we'll look at what bettors on PredictIt, just a political betting website, what they are thinking now. And so I just wanted to quickly bring that up in this discussion. So right now, for their question of whether or not Republicans, who will control the Senate after the November elections, currently it stands that there's a 75-cent bet that Republicans will keep control of the U.S. Senate, with Democrats holding and regaining control at 29 cents on PredictIt. So that's an interesting metric to see how that might develop over time as we get closer to November. We just got news that Kennedy is retiring from the Supreme Court, so that could very well energize Democrats heading into these final rounds of primaries and heading into November. So there's a lot of time left before November for these Senate elections, and a lot of factors, like Kennedy, that could crop up over the next couple of months. So now let's kind of take a step back from federal and talk a little bit more about state and what waves can mean in the state context. So we have seen Republicans in recent cycles having historic pickups at the state levels. What would it take for Democrats to reverse that trend in 2018 and create a wave in their direction? So we've almost watched Republicans have this big wave in 2010 and the following few elections, and then we've just seen the tide continue to go in their favor, if we're continuing the wave analogy. And right now there are 33 Republican governors across the country, only 16 Democrats, and 1 independent governor. What would these numbers need to look like after 2018 for this election to be considered a Democratic state wave?
That certainly is remarkable news about Justice Kennedy's retirement, and we'll have to see how that affects the prospects that we've been discussing so far. But as far as gubernatorial data goes, I really think it's the most interesting, because it's probably where, if a wave does materialize, it's the most likely area that we're going to see it in. So under our definition, Democrats would have to pick up 7 seats to make a wave. And ironically enough, this trend towards Republicans in state elections that you were referring to during the Obama presidency actually leaves them more exposed to a wave in 2018. So this is because the 2010 Republican wave swept in a bunch of GOP governors who are now term limited and are leaving open seats behind them. And fortunately for Democrats, many of these seats are in states that voted for Clinton in 2016, or ones that only narrowly voted for Trump. Some of the states where you might see the Democrats win are Florida, Illinois, Iowa, Maine, Michigan, Ohio, Nevada, New Mexico. So you can see there's a lot of possibility for them to pick up seats and reach this 7-seat wave figure. Republicans have a few opportunities too. Alaska, Connecticut, Minnesota, a few more all possible pickups that could possibly kind of fight off this Democratic wave, even if Democrats do well in these swing states. But one thing to keep in mind here, though, is that even a waive for the Democrats would not give them a control of a majority of governorships that are up this year, which really just speaks to how well Republicans have done over the past 8 years. Democrats would actually need to take 10 governorships in order to have 19 of the 36 states up in 2018 under their control, which is a pretty heavy lift for them.
It is, and just even looking at that spreadsheet we have up right now with the Cook and Sabato and Inside Elections ratings, it tells you something when you look at states like Massachusetts and Maryland that are blue states pretty much through and through, and you have likely Republican and safe Republican holds on those incumbent governors. So this state level, seeing these popular governors and what they've been able to do is in terms of the electorate over the past 4 years since they were elected in 2014, you do see a lot of Republican strength in these state capitals. And expanding on that, what about state legislative elections? So I can never remember the exact figure, but there's something like, you can tell us, but we see however many thousands of state legislative elections that are happening in 2018. How many would have to flip from R to D to see a Democratic wave there?
Yeah, so here we have Democrats would have to win 494 state legislative seats, which is over half of what they lost during the Obama presidency, which was about 950 seats. So state legislative waves, they are very closely related to U.S. House waves. In fact, historically speaking, almost all of the state legislative and House waves happen in the same years. This is because these types of elections, they share a few similarities. One are that they mostly have smaller district constituencies rather than statewide constituencies like Senate and gubernatorial states have, and because most of them are up every 2 years like U.S. House seats. So even if Democrats do win these 494 seats in 2018 and have a wave, again, this is not going to get them to half of the country's state legislative seats, much like a gubernatorial wave wouldn't get them to half of the country's governorships. Again, this just shows that Republicans really dominated statewide elections during the Obama presidency. We've already seen somewhat of a Democratic surge in state legislative elections so far since the 2016 election. As of June 25th, they had netted 20 state legislative seats in special elections, and they won another 18 seats in the 2017 elections in New Jersey and Virginia. And based on how we calculated our data, these seats will actually count towards their total seats for 2018 for calculating a wave. So if you look at it that way, Democrats are already about 8% of the way toward having a wave in 2018.
Just off the top of your head, you might not have calculated this, but one thing I'd be interested to know is of the 20 in this 2018 special elections and the 18 from New Jersey and Virginia, was that over the 20% threshold of the elections that happened over that same time period? Like, did we see a mini wave during the most recent special elections and those Virginia and New Jersey elections?
The only ones I can really speak to there are the Virginia state elections, and you did see Democrats flipped 15 seats, 15 out of the 66 Republican-held seats in that chamber. So my math might not be totally up to snuff, but that's about 20%, or it's at least close to it. So in that case, the Democrats, most of the seats they won were in seats that Hillary Clinton had also won in the 2016 election. So you might see their advances limited to areas where Democrats have already been proven well to do, or have proven that they can do well. But at the same time, they won a lot of seats that were not on the radar before election night. So that kind of shows that these smaller constituencies in state elections, they make them more unpredictable because turnout of a energized base really just has so much to do with who's going to end up winning these elections in November.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I know that Virginia ended up being a big feather in the hat for Democrats in 2017. So if that tracks, if that trend tracks, we'll have to see what happens. My final question of the day, and again, if you have any questions, if you're on Zoom, or if we see any comments come up on Facebook, please let us know and we can try to answer them. What was the most interesting historic wave that you researched?
So that's a tough question for someone who just spent about 6 months buried in data about wave elections and the historical elections, which are really fascinating. I would encourage everybody to go find a book about a historical presidential election and just go read it so they can kind of learn more about the differences or similarities between elections that happened in the 21st century and some of those from the earlier part of the last century. So because of that, I'm going to cheat and pick 2 Republican waves, which I think show a lot about how cyclical American politics can be. So the first wave was in 1946, where the Republican Party had a wave against Harry Truman and the Democrats right after World War II. And they actually took back the House for the first time in 2 decades, actually since the beginning of the Great Depression, since that election that we talked about it. So Republicans back at the end of the Great Depression, they had been held accountable for the Great Depression, and they had lost quite a few seats as a result of that. But even after the country had a pretty remarkable national victory in World War II under a Democratic government, we see American voters doing something that's really not too uncommon throughout our electoral history, and that is throwing out the party that had been in power and trying to change up the leadership of the country. And you see the same thing in 1994, which is the other wave that I wanted to peg as one of my favorite waves. So even though the Republicans had held the White House and the Senate on and off throughout the 20th century, they had been out of power in the House for 50 years at this point, for over 50 years. But in 1994, they ran a nationalized campaign against President Bill Clinton, particularly by highlighting his attempt to change the country's healthcare system and by having a Contract with America policy platform. And running on this national platform, they ended up taking the House back. So I think these waves are particularly interesting because they not only show that these electoral tides can sweep a party into power, but they show that even after being in power for a long time, that party is eventually gonna leave. The wave is eventually going to recede and either be replaced by a new wave or a series of small elections that kind of erodes away this majority that was brought in the first place. So I think it also shows that no matter how hopeless electoral situation looks for a party after any given election, American politics cycles in and out, and eventually parties return to power, regardless of what any given election looks like.
Yeah, those 2 are fascinating. And it also just shows that the electorate itself changes in a lot of these cases. Speaking of studying presidential elections, in college I had to do a thesis on Romanism and rebellion. So you look back at that and the thoughts about Catholicism back then versus the electorate now, and I mean, things change. So it is good, though, to set out a definition of if we do see gains from the Democratic Party in 2018, how does that compare historically? And those are 2 great examples of what that can look like. So thanks again for this information, Rob. Stay tuned at ballotpedia.org. We're continuing to cover the primaries that are leading up to these November elections. And then, of course, we will be here around the clock in the next few months trying to figure out what the indicators are of a possible wave, what it'll look like. So stay up to date with us, including with our Daily Brew newsletters, our Heart of the Primaries, our weekly tap. Go to ballotpedia.org to sign up for more, and please stay in touch with us. So thanks again, Rob, and have a great rest of your day, everybody.